All right, so the next part of this lecture, how does the social world become part of who I am? Is the self, how we view ourselves, the same everywhere? So, if I asked everybody in the world to complete the I am statement, you think people would answer in the same kinds of ways? Probably not. Okay, some are going to emphasize traits, achievements, uniqueness, personal goals. Others, maybe family relationships, group memberships, and none of those are better, more developed, or anything like that. They're just what is more culturally emphasized. Now, culture doesn't determine every individual. We're just talking about tendencies or what's emphasized, not rigid rules necessarily. Because individuals within every culture vary enormously. I just have to say that. So, in regard to that, sorry, the last lecture is converting again. Conversion, conversion, conversion. Okay, so does culture influence what it even means to be a self? That's interesting. And takes us to individualism and collectivism, which I know that you know these concepts, but Hofstede often associated with cultural dimension, often associated this with cultural dimensions. Now, um, individualism or individualistic countries, they're going to emphasize independence or autonomy, choice, personal achievement, self-expression. Be yourself, follow your dreams, stand out. Who am I? Collectivistic countries, you're obligated to the group, relationships, families, goals of the group, harmony, fitting in. Now, not so much what do I want, but will this affect my family or the group? Cultures are going to vary in their average emphasis, and regions, subcultures differ as well. So I have this visual up here, and so I can't say like everybody in the US is individualist in nature, or Asian, or is all collectivist. Again, there's variation, but on average, you can see that again, a lot of North America very much individualistic in nature, minus Mexico here, and Western Europe. Then you look at the remainder of the world, other than Australia. Sorry, Australia. You're pretty individualistic as well. So is South Africa. A couple of areas of South America. Otherwise, you are looking at fairly collectivistic areas or somewhere in between for that matter. But okay, maybe as an example of this, you're trying to decide on what you want to do as a career. The individualistic framing might be, okay, what is going to make me the happiest? A more collectivistic framing might be like, okay, which choice is going to work best for me and my family? Neither are selfish or selfless. It's a different weighting of individual and relationship or relational obligations. And so the thing is people can be highly independent in one area and interdependent in another. For example, you might be academically independent, but personally very family centered. And so this leads us into Marcus and Kitayama. Okay, the independent and interdependent self. So, um, in regard to the independent self, this self is experienced as distinct from others. It emphasizes things like traits, preferences, abilities, and personal goals. Okay, and so that would be like A, okay, separate from others. I do not know why I just put that emphasis. That was kind of condescending. I do not know where that came from. Apologies. The interdependent self, on the other hand, is experienced as connected to others. And this is going to emphasize relationships, roles, duties, group goals, and culture can shape what feels central to me, okay? Whether that's myself or whether that is others. But you can see here the interdependent view of self. Again, we're crossing over into how myself intertwines with others around me. Okay, so who are you supposed to be? Social roles. These are expectations that are tied to a position that you hold. Set of expectations for how somebody in a particular social position should think, feel, and behave. Student, parent, friend, employee, coach, partner. Okay. How do you know how an instructor is supposed to act? Okay. Nobody handed me a script, but there are expectations. I teach, I grade, I answer questions, I maintain boundaries, I dress a certain way, I should be prepared. Same for students, parents, employees, friends. Now, this is what's interesting about roles, and I this is more sociological in nature, but it's still kind of interesting in that it's the dramaturgical analysis of social roles, but it's kind of Shakespearean in nature in that all the world's a stage. And we are merely actors. And with every social role that we have, whenever we encompass one of those roles, we step onto a stage, and that's the role that we play, so to speak. And then when we leave that role, we step onto another stage and we play that role and everything that's associated with that. And these roles do organize our social life and become part of our identity. And they do help because without these rules, interactions are unpredictable. So you can expect how not only we're going to behave, but how others are going to behave. It provides social order. And again, over time, rules can become part of our self-concept. For example, for me, instructor is part of my self-schema. And the role expectations are going to vary culturally because the expectations of like a parent, like what counts as a good parent across culture? A student, good spouse, good employee. It's not universal. Culture is going to supply the scripts for each of these. And again, these roles don't determine complete behavior. People can interpret the roles differently, resist expectations, and redefine the roles. So, what happens when two roles expect different things from you at the same time? Now, this is where maybe it becomes interesting. I guess hopefully it has, but maybe more interesting. But this is role conflict and role strain. Now, role conflict, first and foremost, this is when expectations from two or more roles compete. So, an example, you're an employee and you're a parent. The boss says, stay late. Kid says, come to my event. You can't do both. It's not about poor time management. The expectations literally conflict. Okay? In the picture, you're a student, member, and you're a granddaughter. You need to visit grandma, get your homework done, and go to practice. How are you going to do it all? That is role conflict. We also have role strain. These are when the competing demands occur within one role. So, for example, with an instructor, you need to be accessible to students but maintaining boundaries. Okay? So you need to be rigorous and compassionate at the same time while grading quickly. All of those things can conflict. Okay? Here we go. Athlete. You want to be the best player on the team, but you don't want to make your teammates look bad. It's not being a great teammate. Okay? Being a good student means studying, participating, meeting deadlines, and balancing multiple courses. How do you get all that done? Okay, so can you think of a role you where being good at that role requires things that sometimes contradict one another? Parent. You want to be protective of your kids, but you also want them to be independent. How do you do that? A friend. You want to be loyal, but you also want to be honest sometimes. And that might be tough. Coach, caring but demanding. Now, why this matters for identity? Because if important roles conflict, that can result in stress and guilt and feeling like you're failing in some way because the role isn't merely something I do, it's probably who I am. So a threat to the role performance can feel like a threat to my own identity. And some social roles begin shaping expectations before we even choose them. So from very early on in life, cultures do communicate expectations about how people in particular social categories are supposed to behave. And this gets us into gender roles. So we're taking a turn here. All right. Gender roles, expectations. These are attached to gender. Okay, we're not going to talk about anything else here, but these are socially and culturally learned expectations about how people of different genders are expected to behave. And this can be based on culture, historical period, family, community. Traditional expectations, men, strong, independent, assertive, emotionally restrained, women, nurturing, communal, emotionally expressive, caregiving. These are stereotypical in nature, not descriptions of all men and women. Should matters. Now, there are gender stereotypes. This is when there's a belief about what men and women are like. Okay, and that could get dangerous. But the gender rule is an expectation about how we should behave. And yes, it's interesting because again, these do shift over time. And because they do shift, there's clearly a social component. Men's and women's roles, especially in the household, have shifted immensely, or in the workplace have shifted immensely. And so you can see that there is a social aspect to this. So, and again, just to make this clear, gender roles is not the same as gender identity. We're specifically discussing socially communicated behavioral expectations. So, how do these expectations get from the culture into individual behavior, whether it's social roles, gender roles, so on and so forth? And I do have a timeline of gender roles here if you're interested. It's only up through the 90s, but it's not bad. So, how do we learn these roles? And again, we can go back to Bandura in regard to role socialization and that through observational learning, we observe parents, siblings, peers, teachers, and then we model. Here we go. From an early age, we model these behaviors. Okay, what do people like me do? People in this role behave this way. Okay. And then, okay, also we watch, okay, what happens after what people like me do? Okay. Do they receive punishment or do they receive rewards? For example, child expresses emotion. The response is being comforted and accepted. Or the response is like, don't be a baby, stop crying. Both are going to communicate a role expectation. And then there's reinforcement. And then, depending upon that, that can determine whether or not we conform to that behavior. And again, we may follow these role expectations because we want to be accepted. We want to avoid rejection. Because we assume, especially from a young age, we trust and assume that the group knows what appropriate behavior is. And so that norm becomes internalized. Then it feels like, well, then it feels less like society expects me to do this and more just, this is who I am, which is really fascinating because, again, what happens, there's just a social expectation. And then we do it over and over and over again. And that's just that becomes who we are. And so again, we can encompass these behaviors until they become our self-concept. And yes, that brings us to, again, a bigger idea. Sometimes it's not as simply a role that becomes who we are. It's an entire group that becomes part of the self. So this gets into social identity theory and when a group becomes part of me. So have you ever defended a group you're part of even though nobody attacked you personally? Like maybe they said something about your school that wasn't nice, or they made fun of your hometown, or whatever profession you're going into. Or, okay, somebody made fun of the Huskers or said the Huskers suck. Or, here we go, um, Gen Z, somebody gave your generation a hard time. They're really coming down on you. Honestly, you guys aren't you're not crazy, you're not lazy. I get it, all right? And they came after millennials for a long time. Now it's you guys. Apologies. And again, it's not us that they're coming after individually, it's the group that we're a part of. Possibly. Okay, so again, somebody says people from your generation are lazy. Again, you're like, what? Excuse me? And again, why? Why do we do that? Technically, it's a statement about a category, but psychologically, it overlaps with part of how I identify myself. Again, Husker fans, your team wins. Huskers win. We won. We won. We won. Well, were you out there on the field? No, but we still said we. Team loses. Okay, sometimes you listen for this. You'll hear, well, God, they played so bad. That pronoun shift is really interesting, and we're going to come back to that. But group achievements can produce, again, pride. Group criticisms, defensive-ness. When the group fails, we're embarrassed. A threat to the group, we are going to personally react. Why? Again, it's not self-concept. It's not just about like I statements, like I'm funny, I'm intelligent, I'm shy. It can also include like I am a member of Husker football cult family, army, whatever it is, or Generation Z, or millennials, or this group, or that group. That's social identity. So here's Toshville and Turner, I'm probably getting that name wrong, their theory called social identity theory. So now, our personal identity. This is what makes me distinct. This is the I. This is my personality. This is what I can do. These are the experiences I've had in life. These are my own goals. Then we have a social identity. This identity comes from groups we are a member of or social categories. Students, athletes. Again, you're an MPCC student. MPCC student, MCCC student. That could be interesting. Okay? You're a women's basketball player for the Knights. You're a nurse. You're a teacher. You're an American. You're an Argentinian. You're a Democrat. You're a Republican. You're a Christian. You're a Muslim. You're a Husker fan. You're a Colorado fan. It could be a lot of different things. And again, not every single one of them is just as important as the other at any given time. Okay. And what pops out the most is really interesting. The context can make a particular identity much more important at a given time. So, like if you're at work, your professional identity is gonna, be at the forefront. When I'm out at the college campus, of course, my instructor identity is at the forefront. When you're at a Husker game, I am a Husker fan. My dentist identity is, in the background. My being an alumni of North Black Community College is in the background. When you're in another country, maybe the fact that, okay, if you're from America and you're in Italy, being American, that may become, again, more integral. Different parts of who we are more accessible or less accessible in different situations. So when it comes to, okay, the logic behind social identity theory is we categorize us versus them. I am one of us, and once I categorize us, there's emotional significance. Once I categorize myself as a Husker fan, there's emotional significance. And if the group is positively valued, it could contribute to my positive self-concept. Again, and so this does help to explain in-group favoritism. Not, I hate like Colorado fans or Oklahoma fans, but I prefer and support Husker athletics. So, okay. If group success, okay, can become psychologically connected to the self, we should be able to observe people trying to associate themselves with successful groups, and researchers actually have. Okie dokie. Cialdini and colleagues in 1976 conducted a study. It's called Basking in Reflected Glory. The basic idea, it's a social identity application, by the way. Basic idea. Okay, you didn't score a goal, you didn't tackle anybody, you didn't coach. But team success can still produce a self-esteem boost because the team is part of us. I am a fan of the Huskers. They didn't do this with the Huskers, by the way, but this is the example. So team success becomes psychologically connected to who I am. The Huskers winning every Saturday becomes psychologically connected to who I am. And the research shows, Cialdani, they showed that after wins, again, they did this with university students after football games, and after wins, there were much more school identifying clothing that was worn. And they examined the pronoun use. When they won, they said, when the team won, they said, we won. When the team lost, again, the students said they lost. Okay, the distancing, they have called it corfing. You have burgeoning in the bottom, basking in reflected glory. The other end is corfing, cutting off reflected failure. Um, anyways, so again, you've probably heard like when the Huskers go to a bowl game, oh my God, we're going to the Pop-Tarts Bowl, which I wish we were. That's a great bowl. But again, who's we? Okay, no, you're not going to the bowl. The Husker football players are. But psychologically, this team membership is incorporated into identity. Again, and so it's not just sports. This can happen university, hometown, employer, profession, country. And so, and again, it has to do with reputation. People might publicly associate themselves with successful others because that association reflects positively on them. So yeah, my friend of a friend of a friend produced this movie, or my friend of a friend of a friend knows Tom Brady. Social identity helps to explain why group success feels good. Group criticism feels threatening. And so people will protect group reputation, but here's what's more surprising. How meaningful does a group have to be before we favor it? Like being a member for so long, having a shared history, having really tight relationships, or being emotionally connected? Tajfel tested something even much more extreme. And so, what if the group means very, very little? Almost nothing. That gets into the minimal group paradigm. So, Tajfel was interested in the roots of intergroup bias. Okay, you can think about groups that normally matter: family, nationality, religion, political groups. And again, usually there's history, relationships, meaning, and emotion associated with them. That's where we expect group loyalty to require those things. So, of course, of course, they favor these people. They care about them. They're emotionally connected. But how much group meaning is actually necessary? Just being a part of the group, just categorization alone be enough. And so Tajfel created groups with no history, no interaction, no competition, no personal relationships. Essentially, arbitrary distinction. Then asked, will in-group favoritism still appear? And so the prediction question is if you were randomly assigned to a group called a blue group and never met with another blue, would you care whether the blues got more points than the quote unquote green group? Okay, in general, I'd probably say, if I didn't create this whole thing, probably say, like, no, I know nothing about this group hardly. Now, he went ahead and studied this. Okay, and again, so in regard to this, the participants were divided into groups using arbitrary distinctions. Um, supposed artistic preferences. Now, the group itself meant virtually nothing to these participants. The participants didn't know the members, they didn't interact, they had no history, they didn't share any goals. Now, there was an allocation test. Participants were given matrices, options for distributing points and rewards, and recipients were identified only by a participant number and group membership. So something like, okay, member 47 of the Klee group, member 62 of the Kandinsky group. That's all they knew. Now, there was an important control here is the allocator couldn't personally benefit. So not, I'll give my group more because I'll get something. No, that's not how that works. So does simply knowing one of us versus one of them influence what they give out? Okay. And again, the answer is like, okay, no, they shouldn't care. But okay, what happened? Even with meaningless group assignments, there was in-group favoritism. Participants favored the in-group. And it was remarkable because they had no friendship, they had no history, they had no personal gain, there was no meaningful conflict. They didn't know each other. These groups were just basically randomly invented, but us mattered. It's particularly interesting that sometimes allocation choices suggested participants cared about relative advantage. So, okay, I hope this is a simple example, but we'll see. It's not in the exact matrix, but option A, us with 15, them with 14. Option B, us 12, them 7. So they could sometimes prefer B. And why that's interesting, in B, our group receives less absolutely. But there's a gap between groups. The gap between groups is larger. So the concern isn't only how much do we get? It became how are we doing compared with them? So this is where we get back into social comparison. Now the comparison's not happening at the individual level, it's happening at the group level. Not am I successful, but is my group doing better? This study shows that in-group favoritism can emerge very easily. And again, bias, and again, nothing necessarily harmful here, but bias can begin simply as favoring us rather than hating them. And that's really important social psychological distinction. So why would an arbitrary group affect behavior at all? And I do have this in group, in out group here for you if you guys would like as well. So why favor us? Okay, first, okay, there is an us versus them. It creates a social boundary. Then we identify with that side. I am one of quote unquote us. Even an arbitrary identity can become temporary relevant. Now we can compare ourselves to others. Now groups become comparison targets. How are we doing in comparison to them? Then we have positive distinctiveness. People generally are motivated toward positive self-concept. And so if the group contributes to itself, a positive group identity can reflect positively on ourselves. So we are going to favor our group. And if our team wins, we win. So the group success becomes relevant to ourself and our identity. Even a tiny categorization can produce enough identification to alter resource allocation, for God's sakes. Again, it's not automatic. It's merely correlative in nature. The context matters. But it demonstrates something pretty profound, is the boundary between me and my group, it's very flexible. And we did in week 8 talk about us versus them and psychological distance. And now we can understand another reason group boundaries matter. It's because us can become part of me. And so that's why it helps to explain group praise can feel personal, group criticism can feel personal, group success can feel personal, and threats to the group can feel personal, but we don't belong to only one group. And that's actually really important here because we do have multiple social identities. We could be a parent, friend, student, employee, athlete, community member, cultural member of multiple cultural groups all at once. And again, depending upon the context, a certain social identity may be more important than others. So you travel internationally, so your nationality may, come to the forefront. But when you're at home, nationality really probably doesn't cross your mind. Same identity existed before, the context is what activated it. And again, some of these can overlap. They intersect in how we live our lives. And so context might bring different cultural identities forward. And it's not two personalities, it's just multiple frameworks available to ourself. Now, in regard to this, there's important implication here for social identity in that if I only see you as a member of an outgroup, there might be distance that increases between us. But what if I discover both of us are parents, we're both teachers, we both like the Huskers? Now there's another shared identity that becomes salient. Suddenly them can also become us. And that is an important bridge to prejudice reduction later on. But these group boundaries are not always fixed. This is how we can bridge them. And so here's how we can wrap this up. Again, we started with I am blank. And again, possibly sounded personal, but now we can look at again where these answers came from. We talked about self schemas and possible selves. Who are we possibly going to become? The looking glass self. How do other people see me? How am I doing in comparison to others? How can other people's expectation and their behavior toward us affect our behavior? The sociometry theory and self-evaluation, how culture affects how we relate to others and see ourselves. How society tells us we should behave and how that affects our identity. And then how groups become we and how we can become part of the me. And so if I asked you again to finish the I am blank, would you think differently about it than you did at the beginning of this week? Maybe. So the self might feel like the most individual thing we possess, but social psychology really does show us that even our answer to who am I is built partly from our relationships, culture, and the groups to which we belong. And really much of what we call me is constructed through this concept called we. And I hope you have a great day and I will see you soon.